Islandora as a next generation repository just goes quick and all into so what are we talking about? Islandora is the name for a project which is a Drupal front-end and Fedora back-end repository. And you might think Fedora, I've heard that name before, don't they sell operating systems? Didn't they just get sold for billions? Interestingly, the name Fedora, which stands for Flexible and Extensible Digital Object Repository Architecture, came out of a 1997 Cornell University paper talking about how to architect things for long-term digital preservation. And they actually had the name first. So Red Hat actually had to get permission from this project to use the name Fedora. And it's all about how to preserve digital content. It's a real challenge. Content is constantly becoming inaccessible because you don't have the old Windows 95 or the Atari or whatever the old code base was or machine to run on. So this is very much about how to think long term about digital content, how to preserve material for decades. And it's a real challenge, and I don't think anybody can claim they have the answers, but this is one of the possible solutions for it. You hear me?
Yeah, no, I just want to look at the microphone.
Oh,
I've got it here.
So the Islandora project has got around 260 installs.
Thank you, that's for the video.
Islandora itself, so Fedora's been running for about 20 years. Islandora started in about 2006. And Claw is the next generation of the Islandora project. So most Islandoras out there at the moment are all running Drupal 7 and Fedora 3. The next generation will be running Drupal 8 and Fedora 5. So what kind of things would you use Islandora for? Digital collection management, so that's if you've got a digital collection, it might be photographs, it might be maps, it might be some other digital kind of content that you really want to showcase. So scanned diaries or something like that. Institutional repository, so a lot of universities and research organizations who are churning out theses and PhDs and academic papers, they want a place that they can store that. And obviously these days academic outputs might not just be a PDF, it might be data, it might be code, it could be video, it could be a whole lot of research outputs. You want to put them somewhere and know that it's looked after and maintainable. So I was going to say, in the digital collection realm, other systems that Islandora might be kind of competing with are things like Omeka. In institutional repositories, it might be competing with things like Figshare or DSpace. And another area that can use Islandora is research data management. So increasingly, researchers are using a huge amount of data. This is a mechanism to store it and to keep track of it and maintain it so that the next generation of researchers can reproduce the results. And that's where it might be competing against systems like CCAN and others. And it's also kind of in the realm of general digital asset management. So there's a whole class of systems called DAMs, digital asset management systems, and Islandora kind of plays in that space, but with more of a research and cultural heritage outlook rather than, and digital humanities outlook, rather than say corporate, marketing digital assets. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of what Islandora can look like in the wild when it's been themed up. So University of Prince Edward Island, they're one of the first that went down the route for institutional repository. We've got Simon Fraser University and Vancouver Public Library and a bunch of others I'll show you. So here's Islandora in its institutional repository mode. So this is primarily keeping research outputs, primarily PDFs, and they can be faceted by department or by subject matter, by researcher, that kind of thing. You've got Simon Fraser University using it for research data management, so it's a bit like a Dropbox, but for research collections, research data, and you can see it's mainly organised thematically by research area. Vancouver Public Library, they've got this great public-facing user interface for oral history, so you can look around a map of Vancouver. When you click on the link, you get a little player that pops up with somebody talking about that part of the city. Along with other information. This one I really like just because I think the theming work is just first class, really beautiful work. So these are the May Bragdon diaries from the University of Rochester. Just really nice work, where you've got the original scans of the diaries, and then you've got a transcription next to it. And as well as that, they might have highlighted specific entities. So some of the people and places that are mentioned in the diaries have got their own entries. Just beautiful work. I mean, just go browse it. It's just lovely. And the Michael O'Shaughnessy diaries, he was an engineer in Ireland, so this is from the University of Galway. And again, a set of diaries of historical interest presented in a really nice way. So just to backtrack, this is an example I've been involved with. I've been involved in the Quake Studies Archive at University of Canterbury, and this is just to mention that the same content can be themed and showcased in different ways. So it's the same article in both cases, but with quite different kind of styles. It's a little bit cut off there. So just to backtrack a fraction, how did I get involved in this? So you might have heard about the Canterbury earthquake sequence that happened in 2010, 2011. This was my old office. I used to work in the top left corner. It's just cut off the top here. So that was a beautiful old 1930s building called Kenton Chambers, and this is what it looked like after the February 21 earthquake. Arising out of those earthquakes, the University of Canterbury set up an archive for digital materials. So, interviews and TV programs and newspaper reports and engineering reports and all of the conferences and things that happened afterwards. And they put that into the Quake Studies Archive. And we were part of a move. So first we started supporting that archive, and then we shifted them to Islandora. So we shifted around 150,000 digital objects, so videos and PDFs and photographs and so forth, and around 1.3 terabytes of data. And I actually talked about this at the last Drupal South, so if you particularly want to know about that migration project and what we did, then there's already some video online, but I'm always happy to talk about it. So we're still supporting this particular project, and we're just about to start a digital heritage repository for the Christchurch City Council. That will be similar, if not bigger scale. I think they're talking about going up to 10 terabytes worth of information. So we're really looking forward to getting started on that when I get back to Christchurch. So just a little bit about the Fedora community. It's a group under the DuraSpace not-for-profit foundation in the US. The whole Fedora project is kind of heavily influenced by North American cultural institutions and universities. Fedora itself has around 360 installs around the world, including NASA, so I think anytime you're using a system that NASA also uses is cool. But all around the world, especially North America, Mexico, Canada, through Europe, Australia and New Zealand. They have annual conferences, there's mailing lists, there's code repos, there's lots of stuff on YouTube, so it's a good, healthy, thriving community. And I mentioned that Islandora is Drupal plus Fedora. There are a few other combinations. So there's also Samvera, which is a Ruby on Rails front end. There's Avalon, which is dedicated to video archiving. Arcanex, which is one of the North American universities. So because Fedora itself is kind of headless, it's just an API-driven repository, people tend to build their own workflows and their own user interfaces over the top of it. And one of the things that makes Fedora pretty interesting is the underlying data architecture in terms of digital objects. So you create a digital object, it could be to hold information like a photograph or a video. It has a persistent identifier, and it has a bit of metadata internally about whether this object is active or inactive or deleted, and a few internal relationships. But then it's all broken down into data streams, and those data streams can be almost any XML metadata and any binary file. So it could be a JPEG, could be MP4, could be zips, could be some kind of binary that your scientific instrument produces, and you want to keep that archived. So this turns out to be a really, really flexible architecture that doesn't particularly have any limits in terms of what it can keep track of. What you tend to do is create content models, and that says if you're looking after a JPEG image, then I expect you to have this metadata and this kind of data stream. And if you're looking after, say, a newspaper, then you might actually have a whole collection of objects, one for each page, and then they'd have relations saying this is part of the newspaper edition. But this model can cover all those kind of scenarios. And one of the main things about Fedora is because it's aiming for digital preservation, all of the data is mastered on disk. So all of the metadata is serialized out as XML, and all of the binaries are stored on disk. So if you pull the plug, the whole idea is you can recover from your disk. So all of the databases that it uses, so it uses MySQL and it uses a Drupal store and things like that, those are all populated from the data on disk. So that's your, so you can back things up. You don't have to snapshot DBs or anything like that. It's just as long as you've got a copy of those files, you can recreate the entire system. So in Drupal 7, the current version, they did a lot of work in Drupal using what they call solution packs, and that just tells Fedora, hey, I want you to look after PDFs, for example. Here's the content model to use, here's the form to use when somebody's entering the data, and I want you to display it with a particular viewer, in this case, say PDF.js, so you can render the PDF in the browser. So it has a whole lot of solution packs, which are just nice ways of bundling the form and the metadata and the visualization in one go. And you can store almost any kind of metadata. So obviously Dublin Core terms is one of the most popular, and if you come from the library world, you might be using things like mods, but it might also be extended archival description or premise or Darwin Core if you're into scientific information. So like I say, almost any kind of metadata you can hold in there. So up until very, very recently, I would have been talking to you about Drupal 8 and Fedora 4, but now Fedora 5 is almost out. So I've changed all my slides to talk about Fedora 5. It's pretty much API compatible. But what Fedora 5 brings, and this is where we start getting into the genuine next generation kind of stuff, it can handle the kind of functionality that you would expect from a long-term digital archive. So authorization and authentication, messaging fixity, so that's about checksumming your digital content and being able to periodically recheck that checksum is still valid, so you know whether the data's been tampered with in any way or if it's deteriorated. Versioning, obviously versioning, especially of metadata, is really critical. Fedora itself doesn't really have a search capability, but it's commonly combined with Solr. But it also uses a Drupal store, so in the current generation it's Mulgara, and the next generation most people will be using something like Blazegraph or Fuzeki as a Drupal store. It has a concept of external content, so you might have a really huge data file, say from a bioinformatics run. You've got a 200 gig file already in the cloud somewhere. You don't necessarily want to shift that into the repository, but you can create an external object, a content object, where you keep all the metadata about it in your repo, but you point to an external URI. And that way you can still have it searchable and all that kind of stuff, but you're not having to shift these humongous files. Like I said, it's all HTTP API, pretty RESTful, and in fact the next generation is moving to the W3C linked data platform, so that's full noise REST, and quite exciting stuff. It also has API X, so that's a kind of service discovery layer. So when you ingest an object, for example, one of the first things you might do is build a thumbnail of that image. Or if it's a video, you might transcode it so that you've got a web playable version of the video. And the way Fedora 5 works, it has a whole raft of microservices, and you can tap into those and add in new microservices using API X. So it's basically letting you bind in new steps in your ingestion process or your downstream processing through an HTTP API. So you don't necessarily even have to reboot the system or restart it or deploy new code. You can just talk to the HTTP API and say, okay, inject this service as part of my ingest process. And one of the most exciting things, even though it's probably one of the most driest, is the fact that there is an API specification for Fedora. And I just think this is really big news. It just means that they've put a stake in the ground saying, this is what we think a modern repository should look like from an API point of view. And that does two main things. So A, it's working in the open, working transparently. That's really healthy and arguably something that a lot of the proprietary vendors won't do. It also means that people can start building tools and competing, collaborating alternative implementations. So on the one hand, if you've got a stable API, you can start building up all your tooling to work with that API. And on the other hand, there's at least 6 different implementations rolling out. So The primary one is Fedora 5 and Java, but I think there's also some Python versions, PHP versions starting to come out that can say, look, if you want a different option for your repository, we will adhere to the specification. So it just gives people huge options when it comes to looking after their content. So like I said, it's jumping in boots and all on the W3C linked data platform, which is a way of handling collections and objects in a semantic web type way. It uses the IETF Memento protocol for versioning, so that talks about time gates and ways to reference objects by version and by date. Web access control, so I don't know if any of you have heard of the Solid project by Tim Berners-Lee. It came out of MIT, and he's just done a startup called Inrupt to kind of drive that. So this is jumping in straight on all of that work around web IDs, and also using W3C linked data notifications, which is kind of like web mentions and things, but again, in a linked data way. So the people behind the specification in the Fedora community have basically said, we think the way to handle digital preservation over the long term is pretty much to run with these World Wide Web Consortium standards, which I personally think is a really good idea. So just to give you a really quick intro onto linked data, because that might be new to some of you, but it is fundamental to the way this all works. So linked data, these are the principles from Tim Berners-Lee himself. Use URIs as names for things. So the trouble is most relational databases are full of keys for your rows, for your entities that you're keeping track of, but those identifiers mean nothing out of the context of that particular data management system. I saw a great quote just a couple of days ago from Stardog, who are one of the graph database vendors, and they basically, it was along the lines of relational databases just don't work outside organizational boundaries, whereas the linked data does. And this is all about being able to store your data and keep the context of that data relevant to other organizations and other collections. So instead of having a row identifier for your entity of 101, you would mint a URI instead. You'd create a URL that is, say, Digital New Zealand entity person 101, and that is now the identifier for that object, for that piece of content. And what you should do is, if anybody ever looks up that URI, is you should provide them some content. So that's called dereferencing. And ideally, the content you provide when they go to that URI is in a linked data format, like resource description framework encoded as XML or JSON linked data, which is increasingly popular. And ideally, you should link to other objects as well and other collections to provide that context. And the beauty is we now have systems that can traverse those links and give you really powerful search. Pardon me, oops. Let me just go down. So an example here is, this is a little bit of JSON LD, and it's saying that it's part of a digital NZ schema. It's talking about a person, so it's got FOF person, that's the vocabulary friend of a friend. So that immediately tells you as a script writer or as a developer what kind of content you might expect to have. The name of that entity is Colin John McCann, who is a famous New Zealand painter. But he has other names, so he might also be known or listed in other collections as Colin McCann or McCann Colin John or various others. Because it's a person, it's quite expected that you'd have a date of birth or a date of death. And it's also linking out to other collections saying this entity that we have for Colin John McCann is also the same as this other entity over first at Te Papa, person 1502 at Te Papa, or person 9785 at findnewzealandartist.org.nz. So that's really critical. That same as relationship is really fundamental, because what it means is if you have those declarations, those quite strong assertions of equality, you can traverse those and you can start matching up your information with other people's information about that person or that place or that object, and they might have extra data. So you can start saying, you know, are we all on the same page? Do we have the same information, same values for date of birth, for example? And in this case, some of them don't. And also, you can start enriching your content. So you might only have a stub for this person, but if you can reach out to these other institutions, you might be able to enrich by bringing down photographs or biographical details and so on. And you imagine that multiplied out. Sorry, question?
Yeah, so do those other resources have to have the same schema or the same structure on their end, or is that just a link to a URI?
Not necessarily. So it's just a link to a URI. The whole point is if they are playing in the linked data space, if you followed those URIs, you should get some structured data back from there, but they might be following a different schema. So they might be using the biographical schema or some other one, and it would be up to you to know that, for example, FOF date of birth is the same as this other date of birth field somewhere else. So you've got to kind of follow those models, but that's what the linked data world can let you do. And just one more, so there's also a C also, which is a link to a biography at Ministry of Culture and Heritage, Te Ara. One of the key things, just to point out, a little subtlety around linked data, is that it would be a wrong thing to say that the entity Colin John McCann is the same entity as the biography of Colin John McCann. If you see the difference, one is a person, one is representing a person, the other is a document about that person. And one of the common mistakes is people just jam them all into same as, but there's a fundamental distinction between a person and a document. So try not to fall into that trap. And if we do start publishing our data as linked data, it means we get to participate in the whole linked open data cloud, which is, a global enterprise of linked data sets, around 1,200 as of a few months ago. That huge cluster of kind of reddish ones are bioinformatics. So as a scientific endeavor, the bioinformaticians have jumped on linked data in a huge way, partly just to deal with the challenges of scale. When you're busy, analysing DNA for all organisms on the planet, then you need scale. You need data systems that can handle federation and so forth. And if you do have your data encoded as triples, as linked data, then you can start doing Sparkle, which is a query language for triples. So we're talking about subject, predicate, object, and that's the way that Fedora can store things in its triple store. And in this case, it's a query into the Quake Studies collection, and you can just see that we're saying, tell us everything about the thing that has QSR collection 500. That's the identifier. So tell us all of the predicates and objects that you have for that. And you can see it has things like identifier, collection, description, newspapers published by the press, and so on. So that's how you can start pulling out the data that's relevant to one particular item in the repository. But you can query the graph. So the whole point of linked data is you build a graph instead of tables that are joined relationally. This is a graph, and you can traverse that graph. So Wikidata is one of the world's biggest examples of this in action, and you can do some amazing queries, like, for example, inventors killed by their own invention. Sorry, I forgot to mention that all of these slides, there was a URL at the start, I'll give it to you again at the end. All of these slides are online, so you can follow up these links later. So yeah, it's a bit morbid, but also you imagine trying to answer that query using text search alone, you could be there for a long, long time. But because Wikidata has a concept of invention and it has the concept of manner of death, you can craft a query that references those concepts, and you can find out inventors killed by their own invention. Similarly, you can query the Getty thesaurus of geographic names, and you can ask about castles that are within 10 kilometres of a mountain, again, because the concepts of things like a mountain and a castle and geographic distance are encoded in the linked data. And Auckland Museum, for example, offer a triple store, so you can start doing queries about everything associated with Edmund Hillary or something like that. So this is a really powerful way of accessing data, especially from a research point of view. I just talk a little bit more about Island Claw, this next generation. I've talked about, as I said, Drupal 8, and it was Fedora 4, but it's going to be Fedora 5 any day now. The two are connected using a system called Alpaca, which is based on Apache Camel, so that's a event-driven messaging middleware. So the two are constantly syncing using the messaging infrastructure. The text search is Solr, and then the graph search is BlazeGraph or something like Fuzeki. It's hugely based on microservices, so it means it is complex to deploy from scratch, and there's quite a lot of moving parts, but it also makes it super flexible. And on the one hand, it has crayfish, which is a name given to a collection of PHP-based microservices, and then it has a whole bunch of Java-based microservices as well. And some of the Java ones might be things like OCR. So if you ingest a scan of typed data, then you can fire it off to your OCR microservice and come back with the actual text content. If it's a video, you might fire it off to the local video transcoding, which will be something like FFmpeg, but you might choose to use, Amazon video transcoding or something like that. I mean, just as a tip, you want to try to keep your video transcoding off your main Fedora box if you can, just because it's such a CPU intensive task. And with Drupal 8, it ships with, there's the core Islandora module, which kind of does all the fundamental things on the Drupal side to communicate with the Fedora API. And it also ships with an Islandora demo module out of the box, which kind of stands up a bit more stuff that will get you up and running. So some more common fields and all that kind of stuff. But it kind of leaves, in typical Drupal style, it kind of leaves the door wide open to do almost anything that you want to do. It tries not to be too opinionated about stuff. So, but if you are building anything on this, you almost only want to start with the Islandora demo. And one of the other things to point out is it's also using IIIF, so it's International Image Interoperability Framework, and it's using a particular server called Cantaloupe. This is for tiled images. So if you have a scan of a map, for example, that's 5,000 pixels or 50,000 pixels wide, things like IIIF let you drill down onto those super ultra high resolution scans with the kind of user interface that you might expect from Google Maps, right? You can got that really nice pan and scroll and deep zoom in and out. So they've gone with IIIF and the Cantaloupe image server, and if I have time, I'll give you a quick demo of that. So the kind of process you might go through is you add a repository item, basically as a Drupal 8 node, and the individual fields are all mapped to your RDF, your linked data content type in the back end in Fedora. And so when you add an object, you get an RDF data stream, that's the metadata for the object, and then you upload a media entity attached to that node, and that becomes a binary data stream on that object in Fedora. And then, of course, your microservices kick in. So, hey, you've ingested an object, I'll go index this in Solr, and I'll go index this in BlazeGraph, and I might queue up a thumbnail, and I might queue up some other processes. I might go off and reference one of your other systems to mention, hey, there's been new content ingested. You might have downstream processes where you want to do moderation, and so on. And ultimately, that object is usually available for display. I mean, there might be access control around it. It might be a restricted item, especially if you're dealing with culturally sensitive content, or if it's embargoed because this is part of a thesis that's published in an academic journal and you aren't allowed to make it available for a year or two after publication, all that kind of stuff. But typically, ultimately, it is going to be available for display, and that's where you might be using PDF.js to render the PDF in the browser, or something like OpenSeaDragon, which is the counterpart to Cantaloupe that gives you that beautiful tiling user interface for really high-res scans and so forth. And you might be also making your metadata available for harvesting using OAI PMH. That's the protocol for metadata harvesting. So in New Zealand, a lot of cultural institutions have their content indexed by Digital New Zealand, and here it's Trove, basically pulling metadata in and providing an aggregation service. One of the things that Islandora has adopted is the Portland Common Data Model, and this is an ontology for managing collections and objects, and basically they've reached agreement with the Rails, Ruby on Rails Samvera crew to try to model the objects and collections in a common way across, even though one's built on Rails and one's built on PHP, they're trying to model things in a compatible way, which I think is really exciting. Like I said, the data modeling, it's done through RDF, and you basically map things like the title field of your Drupal node, and you say, I'm going to map that to Dublin Core Terms title field in that ontology. And that's all handled. At the moment, there isn't a user interface for this. It's handled using the Drupal 8 config mechanisms, but there is a user interface project underway. Let's see if I can just quickly show you a couple of pages from a live system that's running on my laptop here. So this is an example of the dev VM. running locally, and here's your tiling image server. Now this isn't rendering to Flash because I haven't got my Tomcat quite set up, so I'll just take you to another one, another instance. So this is a high-res scan of a city map, and you can drill right down, and in fact you can make it full screen and pan around. So if you show, content people this, they love it because it really showcases the material, right? If you've got some beautiful scan of a tapestry or some artwork, then you can do some great stuff with it. So let's just drop back. So you can embed video, that kind of stuff. This is just showing you the fields, so you can add, if you have other fields, you want custom fields, you just add them because it's all the standard Drupal UI. You just have to remember to be able to map it in the background to the particular field. So here we're going, things like field resource type maps to Dublin core type. So you just have to set up that mapping into the back end. Here's the linked data platform user interface. So it's just a REST API, but you can browse around that. Here's the content in Solr. Well, I should run a search maybe. Here's all the content indexed by Solr. Here's the ActiveMQ messaging. So this is one of the beauties of downloading the dev VM, right? It stands up all of these things for you. So you want to be able to keep track of the messaging that's going between all of the different systems. Here's the Cantaloupe image server in the back end that's looking after all of those tiling images. Here's BlazeGraph, which is showing me all the triples that are stored in the triple store, and one of those was DC terms title. Oh, DC terms title. My typing's rubbish, but it's there.
It's just about you now.
All right, thanks. So we've got a few different items in here, extracted text, and then one of those would be for Palmerston North for that map that I showed you. Oh, it's my mouse. And I was just going to, and near the finish, just in a couple of slides, I was going to talk about the roadmap for where they're heading. So they have a Drupal doc and a GitHub project which shows you what they're working on, the different improvements and things that they're making. So let's just get rid of that for a moment. Yeah, so migration into Drupal. Previously there was a migration into Islandora Kit, which was a whole set of scripts that would generate a whole bunch of metadata for you that you could ingest. But now we've got Drupal 8 and we can use the migrate framework in Drupal 8. So if you know your way around any of the migration capabilities, then you can go straight in out of CSV or some external store. We've got the Claw roadmap, so they're aiming for a minimum viable product. The idea is that after the current release of the 7 version, 7.x 1.12, they're going to drop the name Claw and just start talking about 8.1, 8.2 I guess, and 7.x 1.12, which is the latest release of the current version, just came out a couple of days ago. So I don't know the exact timing of when they will call it, release candidate 1 or whatever, but it's very close. And like I mentioned, there's a link to that Google Doc, which talks about where they're at and what they're planning to do next. Just a couple of very interesting little snippets to add. Don't know if anybody's come across Fly System, but that's a Drupal 8 library that can map to, so it basically creates PHP stream wrappers. So if you're in Drupal world, you kind of know about public and private and a few of the other standard stream wrappers. But this lets you add stream wrappers for other types of storage like Amazon S3 or OpenStack, Swift, or Dropbox or whatever. So that's pretty neat when it comes to being able to interact with cloud-based storage, which you need in this world. Another interesting thing is this user interface over here, which was built by the Western Washington University. For their purposes, they wanted a batch uploader, and so they've built their own front end using Electron. So this kind of runs as a desktop-based app. It's all based on web technology, but it runs as a desktop app. And they basically send incoming images off to an AI service by Clarify, and it auto-suggests the tags. So they can say, okay, I'm going to choose these tags, And over here, they also generate what's called a p-hash, so they can say, basically generates a similarity score with other images that they might already have in the collection. So if you're ingesting a whole bunch of images that are roughly similar, then you can say, I'm going to keep bringing in the metadata that I've already added. So it's just a really nice example of what's possible with the technology and a bit of smarts. How do I get back to my... Sorry, get back to my slide. Alrighty. So yeah, if you want to get involved, one of the things you can do is download the VM, but just be aware it takes, so there's an Ansible-based build process for the VM. It took about 1.5 hours to build on my laptop because there's a lot of moving parts, but it is a good way to get up and running. There's a good video on YouTube from Open Repositories Conference about 6 months ago. Check out the website, the mailing list. There's a couple of camps happening, so if you can make it to Switzerland or Vancouver, then there's going to be some major community events happening there. And that's pretty much it. I think we might have a minute left, perhaps. But yeah, thank you very much for coming. I'm happy to talk about any of this for the next few days, and I'll be at the sprint as well. So if you want to dig any deeper, get in touch. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Did anyone have any questions?
The link to the slides.
Oh yeah, sorry. Let's just jump to that. So go escape and go. So kayaker without the e. .gitlab.io/presentations. /presentation dash 2018. Dash Drupal South dash Islandora. But I'll fire out a link on Twitter as well. Or come up and see me if you want a brochure or a card or anything. Thanks.
No other questions? All right, thank you.
Cool. Cheers.